Did X-Men 97 make significant changes to its main villain for the sake of using a popular comic book slogan? Let's find out. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to We the Fandom. In today's video, I'm diving deep into this week's episode of X-Men 97, comparing it to its comic book roots, and exploring the ramifications of the changes made. Tolerance is Extinction Part 1 brings us the most dramatic episode of X-Men 97 yet. We see the Summers family in a rare reunion, delve into Cable's mysterious future, and witness the surprising twists of Operation Zero Tolerance. This episode sets the stage for a finale that will either thrill or exasperate fans of the original series. So let's start off talking about Cable, who arrived in the present at the end of episode 7 to defeat the Trask Prime Sentinel. He's here to prevent Bastion from taking over the world and creating a utopia, his words, one in which mutants are used as slave labor. He failed to prevent Genosha because he was pulled back into the time stream, as has happened every time that he's tried to prevent this future. And this is where we get some overlap with an MCU concept. Because Beast mentions the Mystics of Kamar-Taj, the place where Doctor Strange was trained, and how they believe in absolute points, or an event that always has to happen in every reality, similar to the Nexus event concept from Loki. Doctor Strange does exist in this reality, by the way. He was in an episode of Spider-Man, and there was a brief shot of him in X-Men. Scott, Cable, and Jean go on a Summers family adventure as they track down clues to find Bastion. This family bonding is even more impactful because Cable explained at the beginning of the episode that when Bishop took him into the time stream, they were separated, which means Bishop didn't raise him in the future as Madeline Pryor had planned. In Marvel Comics, Cable is originally taken by his alternate reality sister Rachel to be raised in the future, but only for a short time. When their consciousnesses are placed into clone bodies, Cable's biological parents, those being Scott and Jean, take over as caregivers, and then later he's taken in by Clan Ascani. Cable's history is really messed up, and they simplified it quite a bit in X-Men 97. During the investigation, the Summers discovered the identity of Bastion and his origin, as well as the fact that his mother is a Prime Sentinel, much like Trask was. I want to talk more about Bastion in a bit, but right now I want to talk about Operation Zero Tolerance. So in this episode, it's revealed that Bastion somehow got a hold of video footage of Xavier being named consort to Empress Elandra all the way from the Shi'ar Empire, and released it to the public, leading people to believe that the X-Men lied about his death to gain sympathy, as well as the public finding out that Gyrick, who is thought to have assassinated Xavier, has been murdered. So Bastion has organized these events from the very beginning in order to turn public opinion against mutants. With Trask and Sinister, they have used the techno-organic virus, a virus introduced by a race called the Phalanx, and the techno-organic virus is meant to take over and subsume another race. Sinister has used it to blend Sentinel tech with humans to make the Prime Sentinels. The Prime Sentinels are sleeper agents, so that when they come into contact with a mutant, the programming takes over. And in this way, all the X-Men end up being ambushed by Prime Sentinels. This leads to an awesome fight scene with Wolverine and Nightcrawler against a bunch of the Sentinels, as Wolverine gets to go all out because they are technically robots. And by that, I mean that in the 90s, when the original animated series was made, Wolverine wasn't allowed to stab people because of censorship. But if he was fighting Sentinels, it was fine. Though to be honest, it bugs me that the X-Men right off the bat are willing to kill or fatally injure the Prime Sentinels because they are still technically people. In the comics, the X-Men faced this exact scenario during Zero Tolerance, and the X-Men did everything in their power not to seriously injure them. But before any of the X-Men are defeated, Valerie Cooper releases Magneto. He goes to the North Pole where his powers are stronger, and he shuts down all the Prime Sentinels on Earth to include the rest of technology, which leads to brief shots of Spider-Man, Silver Samurai, and Omega Red. And as a side note, I love how they have these cameos in there. They don't take away from the X-Men, they just fill in the universe by saying, hey, the X-Men aren't the only ones in this world, you're just seeing their story. It feels like a comic book. Dr. Doom and Zemo also briefly cameo as allies to Bastion. Now, Operation Zero Tolerance in Marvel Comics was an international organization, but you didn't see any big names like those two. It was just nameless, powerful people who didn't like mutants. Now, I won't say how the original story ended, but a lot of the X-Men were captured initially and then they escaped, and there was a lot of fighting going on over the course of months, and Xavier was the one being held captive instead of Magneto. Oh, and you can't forget that the Onslaught Saga was the prelude to this, which was a big deal in part because the Avengers and Fantastic Four were in another reality thought to be dead. But now let's get to the question that I posed at the beginning of this video. Did they alter the main villain's backstory in order to use the slogan, Magneto was right? Well, firstly, I'm obviously being somewhat facetious with that question because it's more complicated than that. Bastion in this episode is revealed to be a mutant who can interact with technology. His father was infected with the essence of Nimrod, a sentinel from the future. So he's part mutant, part sentinel, which in a roundabout way matches the comics, except in the original story that wasn't taken literally. Now, as a boy, when his powers first manifested, Bastion realized he could hear technology, and he was receiving these visions of the future, which were really just goals programmed into him by Nimrod. And at one point, he questions who he is and what he is, and in a scene that resembles the Superman origin, his mother responds to him by saying, "You are my son." So in the present day, Bastion is going to war against mutant kind, experimenting on humanity to save humanity, and it's not directly stated, but it's subtly implied that this is his great destiny, that he has to take all of this on his shoulders. You could almost say that he has a messiah complex. See what I did there? Quick side note, I started reading Wolverine's X-Force last week. I read through Messiah Complex and Messiah War the day before this episode, and I was like, oh, they're blending elements of the X-Force storyline with Operation Zero Tolerance, because using the techno-organic virus to make Prime Sentinels wasn't something that Bastion did during Zero Tolerance. They just put Sentinel nanotech in people. But in the primarily X-Force storyline, he used the virus to bring mutant haters like Trask back from the dead and turned him into a Prime Sentinel much like he did in X-Men 97. Now before I talk about what all this has to do with Magneto, I need to explain the differences between Bastion from X-Men 97 and Bastion from Marvel Comics. It's revealed in the story Machine Man Bastion that Bastion was never a human being. In fact, he was never born in a traditional sense. If you watched my review of the last episode of X-Men 97, you might remember the fact that Master Mold and Nimrod, two different versions of Sentinels, were fused together. And when pushed through a portal called the Siege Perilous, they were fused and became a mutant of sorts, but that's more metaphorical. And in the last video, I said he was a mutant sentinel or a human sentinel hybrid, but in reality, he's not really human. He believes he's a human, but his body is entirely synthetic. Bastion is brought into this world as a fully grown man, but with the brain of an infant. He's taken in by a woman named Rose and raised to be a good person. However, he starts to see stories about mutant attacks in the news and sees this as a threat. And like a reactionary teenager going on the internet for the first time and learning about climate change, he overreacts and feels deeply compelled to change the world. And in large part, that's because of the programming. And that's when he starts to gather allies in people like Graydon Creed, the leader of the Friends of Humanity, Henry Gyrick, and building an international coalition made up of nameless people in power who also want to see the end of mutant kind. His ultimate goal is the same as Bastion from X-Men 97. The main difference being that Bastion in the source material believes he's a human being. Like purely human, not a mutant with any powers. He doesn't know he's a sentinel. He doesn't know that he has any programming. He simply knows that he needs to save humanity from the mutants. And the fact that he's unaware of his programming makes him a tragic figure, because there are a number of moments where people question his humanity, and he even questions it himself. And he gets incredibly distressed over the fact because he always kind of felt like there was something not quite right about himself, but he doesn't like being compared to mutants or even sentinels, because the programming is so strong that it's forced him to kind of believe wholeheartedly that he is a human, and any suggestion otherwise, I guess in a way kind of fights against that programming. Now he is still evil, so he's not necessarily as sympathetic as you would see some villains nowadays, but in some cases you kind of see him as just a regular guy who feels like he needs to save the world. Like he's a guy who loves his mother and still kind of believes in the lessons that she taught him. And he feels like his attitude simply reflects the world that he lives in and the threat that humanity is facing. At various times, I wouldn't say he sympathizes with mutants, but he understands their plight because he feels that humanity is in the same boat. He even tells Charles Xavier when he has him in captivity, because in the comics it's Xavier that he's captured, not Magneto. He tells Xavier that his dream of coexistence between humans and mutants is completely noble, but that he simply failed. And he later on tells Iceman that if he could come up with a way to create genuine peace between humans and mutants that wouldn't end with the humans being under the boot of mutant kind, that he would do everything possible to make that happen. But he just doesn't see it. And again, that's part of the programming, but I think it's also just kind of, when you look at Marvel Comics and you look at the history of humans and mutants, that's kind of just an easy guess that there won't ever be true lasting peace between humans and mutant kind. Especially when you have people like Magneto flying around and saying that mutants are the master race. Another example of how comic book Bastion is different from the TV show is that he questions his own morals. He wonders, like, what's wrong with me? Why am I acting like this? And he even has moments where he questions his goals. For instance, he has Jubilee imprisoned, and when she manages to escape and one of the guards is accidentally killed, she stops to give him CPR. All the while, Bastion is kind of watching this and thinking, why is she doing this? We wouldn't think twice about putting her down, and she has a chance to escape, yet she's taking the time to save her enemy. He has a number of moments like that where his conscience, which was ingrained in him by his adoptive mother Rose, comes to the forefront and he questions his purpose. So comic book Bastion is without a doubt a villain, but he's also a tragic figure who in a way is simply a victim of his programming. He believes he is truly doing what is right for humanity. Whereas X-Men 97 Bastion, he's kind of drunk his own Kool-Aid. He's truly bought into the idea that he's the savior of humanity. Not just taking it on as something that he feels like he has to do in order to protect humans, but as if he gained this great destiny. He had loving parents who always told him to try and achieve his dreams, and it turned out that he was being programmed to dream of a future where mutant kind was gone or enslaved. So what are the implications of these changes, and how do they affect the storyline? As I've mentioned a couple times now, Xavier was the one captured by Bastion in the comics. Bastion was Xavier's foil. In X-Men 97, Bastion is Magneto's foil, and I believe that they have altered his backstory to match that. Season 1 of X-Men 97 has been a story about Magneto. He is trying to come to terms with how he can enact Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, and having to fight his own convictions and what his past has led him to believe about humanity. But now, Bastion has proven Magneto right. And so I think you get a more stereotypical, slightly one-dimensional version of Bastion. A more cynical version of Bastion to match the more harsh and cynical Magneto versus Xavier. It's a statement about humanity, about how we always return to violence and the ugliness of the human character, and that statement basically justifies the actions of Magneto, leading to the phrase,
Magneto was right.
So that's my hypothesis on why they changed Bastion for X-Men 97. Feel free to let me know what you think, especially if you've read Operation Zero Tolerance. At the end of the episode, after the dust has settled and the Prime Sentinels seem to be taken down, that's when Xavier arrives on cue and summons the X-Men. And so, as I said at the beginning of the video, I think we can expect a very predictable final showdown between Xavier and Magneto in the finale, because the circumstances that have been set up have put Magneto and Xavier back where they were at the end of X-Men Season 5, except that Xavier isn't dying. So Magneto has no reason to ignore his own convictions, especially now when he gave Peace a chance and Bastion proved him to be correct. Overall, this was a great episode. I don't know if I would call it the best episode so far, but it was definitely in the top 3. However, I would have preferred a more comic book accurate Bastion. I understand that it fits the way they were going with Season 1 and the story about Magneto, but I really appreciated the kind of tragic figure that Bastion was in the source material, and how he didn't realize he was a Sentinel. He had this programming, and while he understood that he was doing some terrible stuff in order to save humanity, his intentions were pure, I guess. But what do you guys think about these changes? Did they enhance the story, or would a more faithful adaptation of Bastion have been preferable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're familiar with Operation Zero Tolerance, I'd love to hear your comparisons. If you enjoy this breakdown and want to dive deeper into the world of X-Men 97 and its comic book origins, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more content like this. Thanks for watching.